Ever since my old Ford sedan had seen its better days, I'd been keeping it alive with duct tape and prayers. The car was a 1998 model, with more than 2 decades of rust and grime, and the engine growled like an old dog with a bone to pick. It wasn't pretty, but it got me from point A to point B. At least it used to. It all started on a cold October night. The air was crisp, carrying the first hints of winter. I had just finished a late shift at the diner, exhausted and eager to get home. The drive was about 30 minutes through the back roads, quieter and quicker than taking the highway. As I slid into the driver's seat, the familiar creak of the worn leather greeted me. I turned the key, and the engine reluctantly roared to life. The first 10 minutes were uneventful, the road deserted and bathed in the pale glow of my headlights. Then, out of nowhere, I heard it. The faintest whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind sneaking through a crack in the window. I rolled up the windows tighter, dismissing the sound as my imagination, but the whispers persisted. They were soft, barely audible, like someone trying to speak without being heard. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror, scanning the empty back seat. Nothing. I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was just the hum of the tires on the rough asphalt. Another 5 minutes passed, and the whispers grew louder. They were still indistinct, but there was a cadence to them, a rhythm that suggested language. My grip tightened on the steering wheel as unease settled in. I glanced at the back seat again, and for a split second, I thought I saw a shadow move. My heart skipped a beat. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. The whispers had stopped. I laughed nervously, feeling foolish. "You're just tired," I told myself. "Just get home and get some sleep." I focused on the road, trying to ignore the creeping dread. But the peace was short-lived. The whispers returned, more urgent this time. They sounded closer, as if someone was sitting right behind me, breathing down my neck. I could almost make out words now, though they were still too muffled to understand. "Stop it," I muttered, my voice shaking. "Just stop." But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, filling the car with their eerie presence. I could feel my pulse quicken, my palms slick with sweat. The air inside the car seemed to thicken, pressing down on me. "Turn left," a voice finally said, clear as day. My heart pounded in my chest. I looked in the rearview mirror again, expecting to see something, sitting in the back seat. But it was empty. My mind raced. Had I imagined it? Was I losing my grip on reality? "Turn left," the voice repeated, more demanding this time. I reached for the radio, hoping some music would drown out the whispers. But the radio wouldn't turn on. The static filled the car, blending with the whispers, creating a cacophony that made my head throb. "Turn left!" The voice was almost a scream now. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel. I approached an intersection, and without thinking, I turned left. The moment I did, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing in on my ears. I let out a shaky breath, trying to calm my racing heart. "See? Nothing to worry about," I told myself, though my voice was unconvincing. The road was darker here, the trees thicker, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The sense of unease returned, stronger than before. I wanted to turn back, but the narrow road offered no place to turn around. The whispers returned, but they were different now. There was a sense of urgency, a warning. "Stop," they said. "Stop the car." I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a face staring back at me. But the back seat remained empty. "Stop the car," the voice repeated, more insistent. I hesitated. Every instinct told me to keep driving, to get as far away from this place as possible, but something in the voice compelled me to obey. I slowed the car, pulling over to the side of the road. The engine idled, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the car door locks clicked open. My heart leaped into my throat. I turned around, scanning the back seat, but there was no one there. "Get out," the voice whispered. So close it felt like someone was speaking directly into my ear. I fumbled with the seatbelt, my fingers numb with fear. The moment I stepped out of the car, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, expecting to see someone or something in the driver's seat, but the car was empty. The whispers continued, growing fainter, drawing me away from the car. My feet moved on their own, leading me into the woods. The air grew colder, the darkness more oppressive. I stumbled over roots and fallen branches, the whispers guiding me deeper into the forest. I don't know how long I walked, but eventually, I reached a clearing. The moonlight filtered through the trees, illuminating a small, dilapidated cabin. The whispers fell silent. I stood there, shivering, torn between the urge to flee and the inexplicable pull to enter the cabin. Before I could decide, the door creaked open. A figure stood in the doorway, shrouded in darkness. "Come in," the voice from the car said. It was softer now, almost gentle. I stepped forward, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure moved aside, allowing me to enter. The cabin was dark, the air thick with the scent of decay. I could barely see, but I felt the presence of the figure behind me. "You've come," the voice said, no longer a whisper. "I've been waiting for you." I turned to face the figure, but the darkness concealed their features. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The figure stepped closer, and I could feel their cold breath on my face. "I am the one who whispers," they said. "The one who guides lost souls." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you want from me?" The figure's hand reached out, cold fingers brushing against my cheek. "You have been chosen," they said, "to continue my work, to guide those who are lost." I shook my head, backing away. "No, I don't want any part of this." The figure's grip tightened, pulling me closer. "You have no choice," they whispered. "The whispers have claimed you." Before I could scream, the darkness enveloped me, the whispers consuming my mind. I could feel myself slipping away, my thoughts blending with the eerie cadence. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my car, parked on the side of the road. The engine was off, the night silent. I blinked, disoriented, my heart racing. Had it all been a dream? A hallucination brought on by exhaustion? I looked in the rearview mirror, and my blood ran cold. In the back seat, a shadowy figure sat, eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. "Drive!" the voice commanded. With trembling hands, I started the engine. The whispers returned, guiding me once again. This time, there was no escape. The whispers had claimed me, and I was their servant, destined to guide the lost souls who dared to wander the dark, lonely roads. The night was thick with fog, wrapping around the car like a shroud. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white in the dim light. My passenger, Laura, sat beside me, her face illuminated by the ghostly glow of the dashboard. "This fog is getting worse," she said, her voice tinged with unease. "Do you even know where we are?" I glanced at the GPS, but it was useless, just a blank screen. "I'm not sure," I admitted, "but we should hit a main road soon. Just stay calm." As if on cue, a chorus of distant whispers drifted through the fog, just barely audible. I strained to hear, but the words were garbled, incomprehensible. Laura shifted uneasily in her seat, peering into the dense mist outside. "Did you hear that?" she asked. "Hear what?" I replied, though I had a sinking feeling I knew exactly what she meant. It sounded like voices. I nodded, not wanting to voice my own fears. The fog seemed to swallow our car, the headlights barely penetrating the gloom. The road was narrow and winding, with no sign of civilization in sight. We were alone in this eerie void. Suddenly, a shadow flickered at the edge of my vision. I slammed on the brakes, and the car screeched to a halt. Laura gasped, clutching the armrest. "What was that?" she whispered. "I don't know," I said, my heart pounding. "But we need to be careful." I eased the car forward, eyes scanning the fog for any signs of movement. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. They seemed to come from all around us, surrounding us in a cacophony of desperate voices. "Help us! Please! Help us!" Laura's hand found mine, and I squeezed it reassuringly, though I felt far from confident. We continued slowly, the fog pressing in on us, thick and suffocating. The voices grew more frantic, more urgent. "We're lost. Don't leave us." A chill ran down my spine. "Who are they?" Laura's voice trembled. "I don't know," I said again, feeling increasingly helpless. "But we can't stop now. We need to find a way out of this fog." Just then, the car lurched to a stop. I cursed under my breath and tried to restart the engine, but it refused to turn over. We were stranded. I looked at Laura, her eyes wide with fear. "What do we do now?" she asked. I took a deep breath, trying to think clearly. "We should stay in the car. It's safer here. Maybe the fog will lift soon." But as the minutes ticked by, the fog only seemed to grow denser, the whispers more insistent. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that unseen eyes were following our every move. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw another shadow pass by the window. This time, it was unmistakable. A human figure, moving through the fog. I grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and opened the door. "Stay here," I told Laura. "I'm going to see if anyone's out there." "No, don't leave me," she cried. But I was already out of the car, the flashlight cutting a feeble beam through the murk. I stepped cautiously away from the car, calling out into the fog. "Hello? Is anyone there?" The whispers seemed to converge, forming a single, agonized voice. "Help us." I turned, and there, standing just a few feet away, was a woman. Her clothes were tattered, her eyes wide with terror. She reached out to me, her voice a desperate plea. "Please, help me. We're lost." I took a step back, the flashlight trembling in my hand. "Who are you?" She didn't answer, just continued to plead. "We've been here for so long. Please, help us find a way out." I turned to call for Laura, but when I looked back, the woman was gone. I shone the flashlight around, but there was no trace of her. Heart racing, I hurried back to the car. "Did you see her?" I asked Laura breathlessly. "There was a woman out there." Laura shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't see anyone. Let's just get out of here, please." I nodded, fumbling with the car keys. Miraculously, the engine roared to life, and I pulled back onto the road. We drove in silence, the whispers still echoing in the fog, but gradually fading as we put distance between ourselves and whatever lay behind us. Hours later, the fog finally began to lift, revealing the familiar outlines of the town ahead. We pulled into a gas station, both of us shaken, but relieved to be free of the oppressive mist. As I filled the tank, an old man approached, his face lined with age and wisdom. You folks came through the fog of the forgotten, didn't you? I stared at him, taken aback. How did you know? He smiled sadly. It's an old legend around these parts. The fog appears every few years, trapping those who wander into it. They say the voices you hear are the souls of those who never found their way out. A chill ran down my spine. We heard them. They were begging for help. The old man nodded. Most do, but you're lucky. You made it out. Many don't. I glanced at Laura, who was still sitting in the car, staring into the distance. What happens to those who don't? The old man's eyes were solemn. They become part of the fog, lost forever. As we drove away from the gas station, the old man's words echoed in my mind. The fog of the forgotten was more than just a legend. It was a trap, a prison for lost souls, and we had barely escaped with our lives. The town was a welcome sight, a beacon of normalcy after our harrowing ordeal. But the memory of the fog lingered, haunting my thoughts. I knew that no matter how far we drove, we could never truly escape the fog of the forgotten. Weeks later, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. At night, I heard whispers outside our window, faint but unmistakable. Laura tried to reassure me, but I could see the fear in her eyes. We both knew the truth. We had left part of ourselves behind in that fog, and it would never let us go. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I saw a familiar shadow outside our house. The woman from the fog stood there, her eyes pleading, her voice a whisper on the wind. Help us. I knew then that the fog of the forgotten would never release its hold on us. It was a curse, a lingering presence that would haunt us for the rest of our lives. And no matter how far we ran, we could never escape the fog, or the voices of those lost within it. For the fog was not just a place, it was a state of mind, a shadow that lingered at the edge of our consciousness, waiting to pull us back into its depths. And someday, I feared, it would succeed. In the end, we are all just echoes in the fog, lost and forgotten, searching for a way out that may never come. I had been a taxi driver for over 15 years, ferrying countless passengers across the city, each with their own stories and destinations. But nothing could have prepared me for the return journey that night. It was late, the streets quiet and shrouded in a thick fog that seemed to swallow the city whole. I had just finished my last fare and was ready to head home when my dispatch radio crackled to life. Got one more for you, Dave. Pick up on the corner of Elm and 5th. Guy insists he needs a ride. Sighing, I accepted the job. Overtime meant more money, but I couldn't shake the weariness that had settled into my bones. As I pulled up to the corner, I saw him, a middle-aged man dressed in a dark coat, his face obscured by the fog. He got into the back seat without a word. "Where to?" I asked, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. His eyes were dark, almost black, and they seemed to pierce right through me. "Take me to 1243 Oak Lane," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. I nodded and started the car, navigating through the fog-covered streets. Oak Lane was in an older part of town, a place I rarely went. It had a reputation for being abandoned, with most houses falling into disrepair. As we drove, I tried to make small talk, but the man remained silent, his gaze fixed out the window. We arrived at 1243 Oak Lane, a dilapidated old house that looked like it hadn't seen a living soul in decades. The windows were boarded up, and the front yard was overgrown with weeds. The man stepped out of the car and walked towards the house without a word. I watched him disappear into the shadows, and felt a chill run down my spine. Something about the whole situation felt off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Shrugging it off, I drove away, eager to finish my shift and get some rest. The next night, I was back on the streets, the events of the previous night lingering in the back of my mind. As the clock struck midnight, my dispatch radio crackled again. "Dave, another pickup at Elm and Fifth. Same guy." I hesitated, a sense of unease settling over me. But work was work, and I couldn't afford to turn down a fare. I pulled up to the corner, and there he was, just as before. He got into the back seat, and I noticed his clothes were the same, even down to the faint stain on his coat. 1243 Oak Lane, he said, his voice the same low whisper. I swallowed hard, but nodded, and drove off. As we approached the house, a sense of déjà vu washed over me. The house stood in eerie silence, unchanged from the previous night. The man stepped out and disappeared into the shadows once more. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to me. Determined to get some answers, I decided to investigate. The next day, I did some research on the house. It had been abandoned for years after a series of tragic events. A family had lived there, but one night, the parents had mysteriously disappeared, leaving their young daughter alone. She was later found dead in the house, and since then, it had been left to decay. That night, I waited at Elm and Fifth, a knot of fear tightening in my stomach. As midnight approached, I saw him again, standing in the same spot. He got into the car, and I mustered the courage to ask, "Why do you keep going to that house?" He didn't answer, just stared at me with those dark, piercing eyes. As we drove, the fog thickened, and I could barely see the road ahead. When we arrived at the house, I parked the car and decided to follow him. He walked towards the house, and I trailed behind, my heart pounding in my chest. The front door creaked open, and we stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and decay. I followed him through the darkened halls, the floorboards creaking beneath our feet. He led me to a room at the back of the house, where an old, tattered photograph lay on the floor. It was a picture of the family that had lived there, and I recognized the man immediately. He was the father. "You were part of this family," I whispered, the realization dawning on me. "What happened to you?" He turned to me, his eyes filled with sorrow. "I need to find them," he said, his voice trembling. "I need to bring them back." A chill ran down my spine as I realized the truth. This man was a ghost, trapped between worlds, searching for his lost family. I didn't know how to help him, but I felt a strange sense of duty to try. "I'll help you," I said, my voice steady despite the fear that gripped me. "But you need to tell me what happened." He nodded and began to speak, his voice filled with pain. "We were a happy family, but one night, something came into our home. It took my wife and me, leaving our daughter alone. She tried to find us, but she couldn't. She died of grief, and we've been trapped here ever since." I listened, my heart aching for the lost souls. "How can I help you?" I asked, desperate to ease their suffering. He looked at me with hope in his eyes. "You must find our daughter. Her spirit is lost, and she cannot move on. Only then can we be reunited." I nodded, determined to help. Over the next few nights, I returned to the house, searching for any sign of the little girl's spirit. The atmosphere grew heavier with each visit, the sense of dread almost overwhelming. I could feel her presence, but she remained just out of reach. One night, as I was about to give up, I heard a faint cry coming from the attic. I climbed the rickety stairs, the sound growing louder with each step. There, in the corner of the attic, I saw her. A small, fragile figure, her eyes filled with tears. "It's okay," I whispered, reaching out to her. "I'm here to help you." She looked up at me, her eyes wide with fear and hope. "Can you take me to them?" she asked, her voice trembling. I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "Yes, I can." We made our way back downstairs, the house seeming to come alive with her presence. When we reached the room where her father waited, she ran to him, and they embraced, their forms shimmering with an ethereal light. "Thank you," the man said, his voice filled with gratitude. "We can finally be at peace." As they faded into the light, the house seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The air grew lighter, and the oppressive sense of dread had lifted. I walked out of the house, feeling a strange mix of sorrow and fulfillment. The next night, as I drove my taxi through the fog-covered streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been part of something extraordinary. The house on Oak Lane stood empty once more, but I knew that the spirits within that had finally found peace, and so I continued my nightly journeys, always on the lookout for those who needed help finding their way home.